There is. I'm just about to put a link into the YouTube channel because the discount code is up on there.
Excellent. Wonderful. Welcome to wherever you want to be. Luckily, with this hybrid life, I'm both simultaneously in London and in Times Square. My backdrop is from one of the projects that we did that I mentioned in the book. This is, it was called Test Pattern by Ryoji Akeda. And it was a part of our Midnight Moment program where artist video goes up on the screens as a countdown to midnight every single night. It started in 2012 and it's been running ever since. So every single night except New Year's Eve, countdown belongs to artists. And one of the things we did for this particular project is Ryoji actually came in hoodie, so he couldn't be identified, and did a live mix, audio mix, along with the projection. So we have this incredible, intensive, immersive sound, and we did it through the sort of silent disco headphones. So that's what's in the background. I put a city on my dress, so I can keep in that. But also in London, and also just want to welcome you from Futurecity. And if everybody in the Futurecity team does a little wave there, we're really happy to be able to host everybody on behalf of this. Very excited about everybody joining in from different time zones. So some of you are having coffee, some of you are having cocktails. And we'll get started very shortly. And I'll go through the formal hello. Yeah. Anybody have any quick questions or anything before we kick off? Nope. All right. So I want to welcome you. This is the first time Futurecity has done a placemaking happy hour. Kind of hoping we continue doing these, but most importantly, we wanted to take advantage of the ultimate day of March to really celebrate the women that are behind placemaking. And it was one of the ways that we could bring out some individuals and really celebrate the many different approaches that make up placemaking. And I think, you know, one of the most important things about this publication is that it does bring up that there's not just one set thing that you imitate. There are many different approaches. All of them can be quite valid, and they'll cross over. And what we're going to cover today, the whole idea of the event is to be as informal as possible. If you can imagine that you are sitting in, say, a basement venue, it's like a little cabaret stage. We're up at a high top table. We've got our little cocktail. You're sitting at your tables, you've got your cocktails. This is the environment we want to have. So we're not going to do presentations. We're going to go through conversation. We'll kick it off with questions to each of the contributors for their chapters. And then we'll go into a discussion. And then after that, we're going to open it up to a Q&A with the audience. We'll pull out certain questions. But because we've got so many people who have joined us, what we're then going to do is give the opportunity to go in breakout groups. And so you can have more direct questions and conversation with different contributors of the book. Then we're going to pull everybody back in. Each of those contributors are going to do a quick synopsis of what was talked about in their group. It won't cover everything. It'll cover a little bit of something. We can capture that little video if that's okay with you. And then we'll have that to share. And then we'll say goodbye. But that's how the event's gonna work. Housekeeping. Please post your comments and your questions in the chat during the event. When you post a question, can you start it out by saying question so that we can grab those and start amalgamating them as we go. Let us know if your question wants to go to a specific speaker or not, and then we can do that. We may sort of take, if there are some questions that look like they are covering the same topic, might turn it into one. We put the hashtag, because of course nothing's real unless it's virtual. So we put the hashtag, if you wouldn't mind using it, if you're going to tweet or put this up on LinkedIn or Instagram or many other platforms that I need to catch up on. If you can, remember to put yourself on mute unless you're speaking or you're in your breakout session, of course. For all of us speakers, we're going to mute our other devices while we talk to you so we don't answer the phone or take a delivery or something. We are being recorded. It's going to be posted on the Handbook of Placemaking YouTube channel. If for some reason, you know, because these things happen, if any technical interruptions, unexpected issues arise, just be patient with us. We're going to do what we can to make it run as smooth as possibly, but we'll do our best. I think the most important thing is that we have one overarching house rule, and I guess this is just sort of a house rule for life, which is that we like to run everything under the banner of respect. So questions are welcome, challenges are welcome, but you know, respect yourself, respect the speakers, respect the work, respect the place that we're in, and then I think that's the easiest thing to sort of guide us through this. And what I'm going to do is just quickly tell you who we've got, and as I call them out, they'll do a little wave. We've got Dr. Cara, who is the main editor of this book. She also has done the introduction, great title, What Really Matters, Moving Placemaking into a New Epic. We've got Rosanna Vitiello, and she is the co-founder of the Place Bureau. And whoops, wrong chapter there. Got to get everybody's chapter's name just right. Rosanna is a co-contributor with Marcus Wilcox, and they have written about rewriting the relationship between people and place. We've got Dr. Adelina Ong, and she has written the chapter Placemaking Through Parcours and the Art, I should do this with French, right? Art du Placement, or ADD, as a Singaporean applied performance practitioner in London. We've got Michaela Shirley. She is a program specialist in the Indigenous Design and Planning Institute at the University of New Mexico. So she is coming to us from the 10 a.m. time slot. So, you know, forgive her if she doesn't have a drink, or forgive her if she does have one. And she has written about the Zuni Pueblo Main Street, and we thank her for joining us from far away. And then Jamie Hand, who is presently the board chair of ioby, but also was involved with the ArtPlace America program, which had a definitive 10-year span. And she is responsible for being able to pull together the evaluation of how we define sort of placemaking and help to turn it into a sector. And so that's the very quick and unfair bios of these incredible individuals. And so I'm going to kick it off first with Cara, as you have edited this incredible book. This is exceptionally comprehensive. It's got 53 contributors, 7 editors. You began this when, at least in the UK, we were at a little bit of an economic high, but also the beginning of the Trump administration in the US. But then, as it's been 3 years in the working, along comes COVID, incredible movement of Black Lives Matter, and of course, other exceptional circumstance of global health and social shifts and pressures. So can you tell us, you started out with one idea when you were pulling this together. Is there one particular surprise or new observation that really pushed its way forward in the process of editing the book?
That's the real biggie. You can imagine that, yeah, the 3 years since getting the sign off from Routledge to say, yes, go ahead and do it, and getting everybody on board. All sorts of things have happened to people professionally and personally in that time. And just carrying all of that through, it's been amazing to get to know people along the way as well. And I didn't expect within 6 months of the final, absolutely final polished manuscript deadline to be saying to the contributors, if you want to rewrite, do, because of the syndemic of what was happening in 2020. COVID, of course, has a people and place dynamic to it. Black Lives Matter, exactly the same. And particularly with Black Lives Matter movement, I was really aware that places that had been mentioned and written about in the handbook were now places that in the immediate memory and you know, in the long-term memory, as I'm sure we'll find out, were places that have been, you know, there were places of protest, there were places of, you know, police brutality, and that couldn't be ignored. So I'm really grateful to the tenacity of everybody involved that they were able to react to that, and really bring the handbook up to date. And I think that points to what was perhaps not, I don't know if it was unexpected, but I guess it's kind of one of those things I couldn't have planned for necessarily. One of the ideas behind the book was that it would mark like the 10 years of, you know, of the decade of placemaking, in a way, where you've got it kicking off with ArtPlace, and you've got it kicking off with the Creative Placemaking White Paper with NEA and Anne Markuson and Anne Gadwell. And I kind of wanted to go, okay, so in the last 10 years, what's happened, and what do we think the next 10 years is going to be like? And reading all of those chapters as a whole, as a composite, they really speak to a really defined practice, and a practice of placemaking that has its principles and its ethics and has a really clear mission behind it as well. And it's to placemaking strength that, as is in the handbook, people coming into placemaking from all different purviews, all different backgrounds, different stages of career, different places in the world, coming from the arts, from policy, community development, wherever it may be, there is that golden thread of this placemaking practice there. So that was quite something, because I think when I'm working in placemaking projects on the ground, it can feel a bit disparate. And with colleagues all over the world, that can also be really connected, but also be really disparate. And just seeing all of this together, it's like, wow, yeah, it's been a hell of a journey over the last 10 years. And we have got to a really fruitful but maturing place as well.
Yeah. Well, that's a great opener, because you know, the next four individuals are going to talk about very different approaches that they've used and questions they came up against. So Rosanna, I want to ask you next. Your chapter speaks of citizens are critical as lifelong placemakers. You also say we speak back to the city, and you talk about the language of the city. I know from conversations with you that you also speak about the nature of carnival as both a literal and a metaphorical placemaking tool. And I just wondered if you can tell us how narrative and also theatrical conventions actually play a role in the approaches that you make with placemaking.
Yeah, sure. Big question. So I think we always look at it in two ways. So one is the streets themselves. You know, what can you learn from the streets, from listening, looking to the streets in a deeper way? Kind of very much the theatre of the everyday, if you want to look at it in that way. And then how does that add up to a more important and more powerful story? So I think some of the examples that Cara just spoke about, if you look at like toppling of a Colston statue in Bristol or Black Lives Matters, show how those bigger stories are super important to us. So we kind of look at this idea of placemaking being meaning making. And if you look at narrative's rolled up in identity. It helps us make sense of ourselves, our place in the world, and how we build our relationships to those places. So if we kind of look at it from the street angle first, the work that I do with Marcus, who I co-wrote the chapter with, we spend a lot of time just looking at people in the street, spending time in the streets. We actually spend a lot of time in New York and in Spain, very expressive cultures. There's a lot of life outside. To see, I'm working with anthropologists, with sociologists, just everyday people, to start to see, how people build a sort of an emotional connection to a place. How do you build a sense of trust in or reciprocity? Very often in those more informal cultures as well. How do you, and I say that in the sense of like, how do you take over a place when no one else is looking? Because often the subcultures are the places to start looking for true identity. And so the chapter builds on a lot of work we started about 15 years ago called Urban Lexicons that started through a series of street workshops to look at just that. What are the What are the emotive qualities and the language we use to talk about the places that are important to us, whether that's negative, like a fear, or whether that's trust. But then importantly, it's what is the bigger story that adds up to? And the work that I do with the Place Bureau, the studio I co-founded, is all about place identity, and we're called script writers for place. So the idea is that we help create this connection between the lived experience on the ground and how we start to build a picture in our heads. Because the other thing around placemaking is it can take a long time, you know, for a place to come to fruition. And we draw from lots of different areas of theatre, let's say, from movie making. But what's interesting about Carnival actually is Carnival has the ability to take over a place through, you know, through theatrics, to literally turn a place on its head. That's the way that the philosopher, you know, talks about it, Michaela Shirley. But in the place, in the streets that you think you know so well, and actually it's able to work in a much quicker time frame than classic placemaking, if you look at it in that way, and totally flip ownership of who, let's say, you know, who that space belongs to, the characters that we inhabit in that place, the movement in terms of making our own space within it. So if you look at Carnival as an act of creative defiance, which is the way that someone described it to me in Brazil, then, you know, there's a lot that right now we can draw upon when we've got a moment to start to reshape the way that we, as we said, that we relate to the cities that we kind of live in, but to do so in a positive way. The creative defiance, I think, is the important part.
I think that's an important part that we're going to come up to and bring into our conversation, and also understanding like how do we structure enough to allow, you know, creative defiance to take place.
Right.
And the other thing I think that's very interesting that you bring up too is just this idea of behavior defining place. It's not just a visual design things into it that make a place. It's how we behave, how we can change that nature and collaborate with the space differently.
Yeah, totally. And if you can, you know, what we're really interested in is if you can change the narrative on a place and change very little about it, can you change the way that people, you know, react to it, therefore behave in it, and therefore the reality of it? If you change the story, can you change reality?
It's a great question. So next, Adelina, I want to ask you. You have a little bit. This kind of segues into that. I love the fact that you're a self-proclaimed lively nomad. You engage with participants in very active sessions. So you use this technique called ADD or AD, and you pull from really unlikely forms like parkour and applied theater and improvisation to actually physically explore the relationship of person to place. Can you tell us also, you've talked about how fear can have a role in this process, and how even dealing with concepts like failure, death, and silliness all can set this kind of invert of dynamic.
Thank you, Sherry. I must confess, I cannot claim to be very good at art du placement or ADD or parkour. I am an applied performance practitioner, and basically it means we take theater or performance and apply that into education, social work, or activism. So this idea of the lively nomad actually came from one of my participants, because one of the things that we do in applied theater is some image theater that is kind of inspired by Auguste Bois. And in image theater, the participants freeze, they make an image of their fear. So like even now in squares, we can move around and freeze and create an image of our fear, right? And she decided she wasn't going to freeze. She decided she was going to constantly keep adding chairs to her sculpture. And when I talked to her about it, she said she was very much wanting to represent a state of perpetual unsettledness, because she was afraid, her fear was of being co-opted and turned into some sort of creative person who obeys the rhythms of a city where creativity is defined by zombie capitalism. So in that sense, you'd be creating two somebody else's definition of creativity and creating to their time scale. And she was very much against that. So the idea of lively nomad kind of came from that. If a zombie migrant, because she's also a migrant who was talking about this feeling of unsettledness at a time where Brexit was looming. I'm a migrant too, I'm from Singapore. And so I kind of believe that belonging is a myth for us with limited leave to remain. But that doesn't mean that we can't participate in placemaking in the places that we go to. Even if we're only part of this place for a little while, there's still a lot that we can do in terms of initiating conversations through place practices and advocating for diversity from the unique perspectives that we bring of place. So what I loved about, the conversations that we had before, during, and after this little applied performance workshop was that she kind of felt that it was really important that I had started the exercise by talking about my own fears first and being really upfront about it. And at that point, obviously, it was just before COVID, so quite a few people were talking about death as well. And when you're a migrant, it isn't possible to go back in a flash to be there for family and friends when somebody has a funeral. The 14-day quarantine makes it impossible to attend. But when we're upfront and we can talk about these things, and also, just say, this is the first time I'm bringing together Art du Placement and Parkour and applied performance, and if it doesn't go right, it's absolutely fine. That kind of intro, she felt, was really important to encouraging this disobedience, this silliness that was present in some of the other sculptures that were made as well.
Yeah, I think, it's very important also what you talk about as far as, belonging, nomad, places are made up of not just a community that has been there forever, will stay there forever and never changes, and community isn't one. And it's important, like you say, to realize that there are people that are filtering in and out of place all the time, but they have no less right to be involved, in what that's going to be. And I think part of what you're talking about as far as starting out the exercise by introducing yourself, putting yourself forward, making that vulnerability, but also engaging in the process yourself to gain trust, is something that relates, I think, a little bit to our next speaker, Michaela. And I also want to
go to another part of the room.
Oh, we can hear you, Wayne. So I also want to just clarify Michaela's title, because I didn't get it right at the introduction, and it's called 7 Generations, A Role for Artists in Zuni Place Knowing. And she is a co-contributor with Theodore Yohoya. So Michaela, I want to ask you, particularly about your chapter covers a term which is a little bit new to some of us, as far as place knowing. And your ArtPlace America grant enabled the Indigenous Design and Planning Institute at University of New Mexico to support the Zuni Pueblo Main Street organization, the first and only tribal Main Street organization. It's very important. Your work considered a very different concern to the idea of land use or stewardship or ownership, land tenure, tribal and matriarchal inheritance of use. These are very new concepts, I think, to a lot of what we're dealing with, particularly in the UK, but may have resonance and translate there. But I wonder if you can share with us this moment when you caught yourself in the beginning of the project and realized that you had missed actually an ancestral protocol.
Awesome, thank you, Sherry. And as also part of my introduction, I will introduce myself in my native language, as customary for my people. Michaela Shirley Genshka, Twabanishledo, Twitch Eni Bashashin, Ashin Dashache, Maidish Gizmi Dashanella, Kendallachite Nasha. So thank you everyone for allowing me that space. so yeah, that moment I found myself realizing that I might have missed a very important protocol came when I was going into Zuni Pueblo, and I was just driving up over the ridge. And when you get to this ridge, you do see like the village and, you know, their sacred mountain, DY, Dawayana. And I had realized that I had been doing months of introducing who I am to the people and what the project's about, but had failed to introduce myself to the land. And so I had to take that moment to introduce myself to their ancestors, introducing myself just the way that I had done with you all, to identify like who I was and why I was there, and, you know, just prayed that the project that we were endeavoring on is something that is going to not do any harm, because that's also a value that the Zuni Pueblo people hold themselves, is do no harm. And I think oftentimes as an outsider, even as an Indigenous person to another Indigenous community or nation, I do have to remember that I am an outsider and that I bring with me maybe some ideas or projects that might not necessarily be beneficial to Zuni Pueblo. So just being very cognizant and aware of that. And yeah, so I just had to take that time to introduce myself. And, you know, and it makes sense because even within my own family, my parents, every time that like I had to go somewhere afar, they'd always make sure that we do a pilgrimage to like our sacred mountains. And what they were maybe in fact doing is actually being in conversation with the place that I'm going to visit. So in the last time that they had done this for me was when I had to go to Ecuador. And so, you know, my parents communicated to our holy mountain that their child is going to go to Ecuador. So like, please watch her. This is what she's doing. You know, she has no bad intentions, and just like, please protect her. And so I think that's part of that protocol that I had to remember for myself, which is also like the place knowing concept. There's a lot of, you know, Indigenous folks who, because of assimilation and colonization, and still the continued imposition of, you know, settler colonial, even capitalistic, you know, impositions against us, like there's still us really trying to find who we are as people, and like really going back to our identity. And so for place knowing, it really is about this place that we come from that has evolved for countless generations. And so we do not necessarily, you know, make places as much as they make us. And indeed, it is a belief that is inherited and has evolved like over millennia, as our ancestors has gained the practical and spiritual understandings of the land that we occupy. And so we call that relationship place knowing. So I'll just start with there, or leave that with that.
No, it's very important, and we're also seeing when sometimes you need to lead with place, and sometimes when you know, change things, like Rosanna was saying, you know, as far as changing it via people and understanding that balance. But I guess part of what you bring up as well is this idea of, you know, being collaborators and having respect for the people, for the place, and how you create something together. It's not one trying to enforce onto the other. And we'll come back to also this idea of introduction, I think, and permission in our conversation. And Jamie, you were working for ArtPlace America, and this was, for those who don't know, specifically intended to be a 10-year initiative. It began with a cutoff date, and the idea was to use it as a focus to embed placemaking across the United States, all scales, rural, urban, suburban, and develop also simultaneously the idea of this as a sector and a field, bring legitimacy to it. And you were having to lay down the groundwork for a lot of interdisciplinary and intersector evaluation, very seemingly impossible task. People keep saying you can't do it. And you were engaging with agriculture, education, community development, environment, health, housing, immigration, transport, public safety. What were their reactions to working with the arts?
Thank you for that question, Sherry, and the sort of 101 on what ArtPlace was or is. I don't know how familiar folks in the UK are with ArtPlace, and I think for the purpose of this conversation and to answer that question, I understood ArtPlace's mission to be making creative placemaking a thing, right? Making it a field, and what we, in my role was as research director. So I'm not a researcher by training. I don't have an evaluation background. I'm actually a landscape architect. So I come to place from public realm policymaking and designing. But for ArtPlace, in order to make it a thing, we needed to learn how to talk about what the arts do and what the arts do in relation to all of the other people that are doing placemaking, all of the other people that in the US context we call community development. And so what I brought to our research agenda to think about how we make it a thing and how we talk about the arts was a sort of a way of making a very participatory process, working with folks, practitioners in these other sectors, what we call sectors, so in transportation, in immigration, in housing, et cetera. And we segmented, we sort of broke it down. Something that Cara said at the start of this call was, the field is so big, right? There's so many different people approaching it in so many different ways. And in order to sort of break down that complexity, ArtPlace took a very explicit approach of understanding what we called it the community development matrix. But we had this matrix where we talked about the different sectors and the different actors in each of the sectors. And so for our research, we approached each one at a time. And when I say make it a thing, we're talking about value creation. We're talking about sort of talking about impacts. And so in my essay, and the way I referred to the portfolio of work, at ArtPlace is called translating outcomes. So this idea of translation and this idea of sort of explaining in language resonant to each of these other sectors what it is that the arts are doing was what we set out to do. And to answer the question about sort of what did I find, what was the reaction, and what most surprised me is that in 2014, when I started this work, we started doing each of the sectors, we thought it was going to be as simple as sort of understanding how housing developers measure success and connecting up to that and translating and using language that they use, and then done, call it a day. Understanding what transportation people care about, understanding what policymakers and public health care about, and just connecting the dots and using that language. So it's very much strategic communications. But what happened in each and every sector, almost without fail, was practitioners and policymakers saying to us, you know what, we're not succeeding. We're not getting it right. We actually need the arts help. We need culture, and we need other ways of knowing and other ways of being and other ways of engaging our communities and doing the work. We've lost touch with the sort of human aspect of the human center. And so that made the work that much more complicated, right? Suddenly now we are helping them think about new ways to measure, new things to care about, and new ways of defining success in each of these sectors. I'll stop there for now, but just to say that was sort of the most surprising and the, both exciting and daunting to hear from other practitioners.
And very important to remember, I think very often in the arts and culture sector, we always feel we need to adapt to everybody else, that they of course have a rigid, tried and true method, and that we just have to justify our role in terms of them. And very important to know, that we actually come at this as equals, not as something that is there to serve it or to be subservient, but actually how we see ourselves as equals. And I guess that goes back to also our basic rule of even today's event, which is start from the place of respect, and assume it for yourself as well as the other people that you're dealing with. So what I'd love to do is get into a conversation with our contributors here. And I'll throw out, there were a couple of themes that we had talked about, but feel free to just steer this discussion, and I'll make sure that everybody gets a chance to speak and such. But I think let's start with this idea of permissions and invitations. Is it giving people permission to be involved? Is it inviting them? And as people who are involved in instigating it, or the people that you're working with to ask to participate, how do you see this? What is the role as far as what we're doing in engaging people with place or noticing it? And I don't know if there's anybody who wants to jump in first.
Actually, I'll jump in with a little Brazilian example because I think, you know, I think this is very different in different cities and different cultural contexts. Like some cultures never ask permission. In fact, they make a play of finding a way around the permissions that they have. So we were saying this in relation to Brazil, that there's a term in Brazilian culture of jeitinho, which means the way around things, which is a way around the bureaucracy, a way around the rules, and it really plays out in public spaces. I've seen people be incredibly creative in like, in essence, kind of, you know, finding ways to subvert. But I think so in other cultures, you know, we find partly because of the measures that are in place, that we need to be reminded that it's okay, you know, to do that. So I think that we talked about this last week, that in Todmorden, fantastic up in Northern England, great project by Incredible Edibles, where they don't ask for permission, they ask for forgiveness. You know, we do it first, and then we see. And if you find something that is harmless enough, in their case, it was, you know, planting vegetables around the town as an invitation for others to come and take those vegetables, eat those vegetables, then that's a way to start sort of, you know, shifting those boundaries and saying, well, because if we only stay within that notion of permission, and sometimes they put it this way, then we'll never move it forward. And I think the idea of an invitation can be a very small gesture to change reality.
And I guess for people, who is it? Yeah. Who is it that is making, you know, either making this invitation or is the one that should be granting this permission?
Yeah, exactly. Because, you know, who's the host? Can that change? Can that aspect of who hosts a place change?
Can you talk, Michaela, a little bit about the idea of, you know, sort of permissions? And, you know, you said about also introducing yourself and asking permission of the land, but also particularly, you know, in your chapter, you talk about how land tenure is passed down through the matriarch. And so I just, if you can talk a little bit about then who sort of is the one who is the steward of the land? Who is it that you were dealing with in order to make these spaces available?
So with Indigenous cultures, they're either matriarchal or patriarchal, and in this instance, Zuni is matriarchal. And so basically what that means is that the first daughter that's born into the family will inherit the lands of the family. And so there's the responsibility then of that woman being able to caretake of like any of the, you know, homes that are built on the land, or if there's like agricultural production or any sort of, you know, livestock pastoral activities that are also occurring on that land. So yes, in that context, it certainly is the women that have become the stewards of that land. And so, and they continue to be so in that respect. However, I think there are always going to be challenges to that when it comes to, you know, heteronormative sort of patriarchal impositions again that come in, that might come by way of, you know, maybe how the tribal government is operating, or maybe even by way of just the different projects that might come in. And so the folks that we worked with in this project were first and foremost primarily the artisans themselves. And so, but the invitation did come by way of their tribal government, who is the governor of the Pueblo, to help steward this project. So yeah, I think it definitely meant a lot of conversations with the artisans, and oftentimes the artisans were made up of couples. And so oftentimes it was the wife usually who was very active and involved and, you know, dictated what needed to get done. And so it was really easy working in that respect on the project with the women, because from my cultural background, the Diné people were matriarchal. So I think there was a natural affinity or cultural affinity to sort of like work with each other and sort of like hone that matriarchal power that needed to sort of be there to guide this project too.
Mm. Is there anyone else who wants to jump on this idea?
If I may, I think in this, the question of the invitation is, you've got some really different, contested, conflicted subject positions in that. And you're right, it is who's doing the asking and how. And it reminds me of the time when I was working with a community garden in Dublin, and somebody came along and said, I'd like to work with you to turn this into there was a particular type of garden space that they proposed, and they were just met with blank looks completely. And the guy said, well, who asked you? And the person was so surprised because they loved their idea. Actually, their idea was really good, but they hadn't been invited to have that conversation with the group. And the way that they approached that introduction, that welcome, of course, fell completely flat as well. And I think ever since then, that was a real reminder to me that you can come with the best intentions, but it's not just saying, you know, can I be part of this? It's a different framing, which is subtle, but may I be part of this? And it's that for me is a subject position that I feel much more comfortable in when I'm starting to work on any kind of project.
Yeah, and I think this relates to also some of the issues we were talking about last week in terms of safety and care. And I think maybe, you know, Adelina, if you want to jump in here, and I think particularly as you bring up this point of, you know, those of us who have the indefinite leave to remain or the restricted, you know, leave, always an interesting English term, the leave to remain. I find great, you know, or if it's in the US, if it's being, you know, if you have green card status or not, you know, et cetera. But do you want to talk a little bit about some of the issues that have come up, particularly with your work in regards to feeling safe and cared for in public space?
It's one that I'm still trying to figure out. In a way, let's connect this to permission and invitation. When I approach participants, I try in that moment of engagement to disrupt hierarchical structures by, first of all, trying to put myself in a position where I destroy any notion of teacher who knows it all, because I think that's a really terrible hierarchy that, you know, we really need to fight against in the room. And so instead of permission, which implies that I'm a gatekeeper, or invitation, which implies, again, the access that somebody else doesn't have, I'd rather make it a space where we're all learning from each other. We're all having this conversation, and they can absolutely disrupt my understanding of the world. And that would, you know, make the lesson all the more interesting for it, because their lived experience is so precious and important to bring to the room. In terms of safety, this is something that I'm still trying to figure out, so bear with me. But have you ever heard of Fatali Moghadam's staircase model of terrorism? Have you heard of that? And I'm talking about this in terms of the safety question. Yeah. As some of you might know, people who look Chinese have been the target of violent physical attacks, often being blamed for COVID of late. And this Chineseness is something that is regardless of race or nationality. So this Chineseness is actually imposed and is not self-defined. It is actually defined quite a bit by what Alan Chun might have called the geopolitics of identity, where the sort of political competition and discourse between two countries actually shifts and shapes the the discourse and the dialogue and the impression that people have, even the conspiracy theories that they consume. So that's Chineseness, where I don't believe that, you know, any of that is actually something that I can control. But what I think I might be able to do is shift people's perceptions of Chineseness. And so I was talking about Fatali Mogadam before this. If you follow his idea that in order to get to the point where you are willing to violently take action against someone, somebody actually starts from a place of relative deprivation, then comes to the conclusion that a community is being persecuted and they must therefore stand up for this community that's being persecuted. And the only way that they can do that is by enacting violence on the person or people who have been accused or blamed for this particular situation. Then that actually has a lot of resonance with the willingness that some people have come to take violent physical action against people who present as Chinese. What I'm saying, in other words, is that we exist in a time where China is blamed for a lot of things. And we exist in a time where the economic interests of countries are such that China is perceived and often talked of as a threat in media discourse. Even if we don't read any conspiracy theories that have come out, our impressions of Chineseness are shaped by these. So, does that necessarily mean that people who present as Chinese cannot get involved in placemaking because it's too dangerous? They might get attacked or whatever. I'm still struggling with this. It's not perfect, but I think that the idea here is that we really need to shift perceptions of Chineseness through conversations. So I've asked some of my colleagues to walk with me to the train station. And on that walk, we talk about place. And where does this, you know, sort of like perception of Chineseness as a threat come from? And hopefully these conversations go beyond just us and they extend beyond that. I've also been chalking graffiti poems underneath trees, signed off with I, which is the Chinese word for love. And these poems are words of comfort and support to people who have lost loved ones, because I think a lot of the aggression and displaced aggression comes from loss. So these are just two ideas that I've kind of been putting together in my head. I might be totally wrong, but this is where I'm at.
Well, I mean, what you're talking about also relates to the labeling theory of sociology, in which when we're in a state and we can't handle or we don't know what is harming us, we label something so that we can direct, you know, the aggression that way. And, you know, that theory has been used to explain prejudice for many generations, and how, you know, how we try and find a perpetrator and do that. And I think it's very important to realize that, you know, we have to think about, even if you want to open up space and encourage people to be radical or to disrupt things, we have to do it ensuring that there is some safety. This is one of the things, you know, that very often, you know, when I was curating in Times Square, and artists would say, like, what can I do and not do? You know, what's prohibited? And I said, it's not about that. It's just to remember that your audience is in a very public space with a lot of strangers, many of them, particularly in that place, coming from many parts of the world with very different cultural assumptions gathered together. The material that you're going to put forward has to be done in such a way that you respect that they're vulnerable in a public space, which is much different than if you go and see a show, you know, inside a gallery. And so I think what you bring up is very important, which is that we have to take on that role of ensuring that we can create a safe place the best we can, and give the signifiers of what sets out the rules that says this is a safe place, And I think also what you bring up about the replacement with a symbol of love, you know, even when feeling that way, replacing the language, whether it's a physical one, you know, a visual language or words, with positive replacements. The more that you can replace it, perhaps that's, you know, what can stick. But yeah, it's something we can never be naive about when we're doing things in public space. We've got to try, and if we're going to invite people, especially if we're going to ask them to disrupt or be vulnerable or change something, we've got to ensure that they feel safe. And even if you don't always get it right, you have to be going towards that. And you've also got to have people there to help facilitate that. So if someone doesn't feel safe, they know where to go. It's just a very, very crucial part of it. I know that we want to get to questions with the audience. I think one thing I want to bring up just before we move on there is, Jamie, in particular, since you were looking at so many projects of so many scales, and Cara, this relates to you also in terms of the work you do in this book. One of the things that comes up is there's a great variance in pace or duration for activity. You know, so while people get in that desperate state of like, hi, do you have a placemaking solution? You know, what works here and how long does it take, and et cetera. Do either of you want to just talk about that sort of range of what's come up in the projects as far as what's the right pace that you take with projects, or what you've been able to witness from what you've read?
Cara, sure. I'll take a stab to start. You know, with regard to my own work, I can easily answer that question in terms of the pace of the work of learning and co-learning with these different sectors, like of the research and the actual knowledge building that happened, had to be slow. It was very slow. The learning curve is high when you're doing interdisciplinary work of any kind, right? You have to take the time to understand each other's ways of working. You know, in my case, we partnered with national intermediaries in the US that sort of, you know, focused on community safety or focused on affordable housing. And that partnership, you know, we were learning in real time about how to create frameworks or how to do this research. And I think that runs very parallel to the way the work happens on the ground in communities, right? You have to take the time to identify shared values and goals, and understand how, you know, working style, the culture of how one works and does something in a community, in an organization, in your home, right? As with any relationship, right? Any partnership, whether it's a marriage, you know, a family member, et cetera. So I think the sort of allowing for spaciousness and time in getting to know not just the place, but the people with whom you're collaborating is a key component. And so that's going to go differently for every single project and every single context. The other way that I would, you know, again, not to be too specific about it, but ArtPlace was a funder. We were a grant maker, right? So we were supporting projects. And so one of the very significant changes, and I also have a background, I worked at the National Endowment for the Arts, which also was the, you know, primary funder of creative placemaking here in the US. And what ArtPlace did a couple of years in was very clearly say, we're not going to tell you how long your grant period is. You tell us, right? And it can be up to 4 years, or it can be up to 5 years. In terms of, you know, a grant and a funder's requirements are very arbitrary compared to actually what we're talking about with this kind of work in communities, which is certainly, yes, there's temporary projects, there's ephemeral projects, but we are really focusing our grantees and the field in the US on sort of what are the changes, what's the social change, what's the community change. And that stuff takes a long time, right? Community change is slow and it's hard to measure. And even, you know, what you might be doing in a 1 to 2 year grant period or a 1 to 2 year project, you might not see the effects of for 5, 10, 15 years or a whole nother generation, right? So being very sort of explicit and transparent from the outset, whether you're a funder or whether you're a partner or whether you're a community member in some work, that this is a long game, I think those are my initial reactions to the question.
I think it's important, it's, you know, that there isn't necessarily the same answer for everything. And really what we're looking for more often is the methodology to step us through the questions and how to get to these answers so you get the right idea. Cara, I know that you've got to leave us in a little while. So I thought if you wanted to answer that and also to bring up, you know, the question and the thought that you have here about, loss, fear,
Mm.
words associated with place moving through COVID, and what does that say when we're out of lockdown? So if you want to cover any of those thoughts before you have to go.
Yeah, so this is the part in the happy hour where I start to get my coat and put a £20 note down on the table and call an Uber. I have to go to leaving drinks, so I'm skipping to go to another party. God, it's like the before times. That question of duration is a really interesting one, and I agree with absolutely everything that Jamie said. And for my own practice, I would rather be in a place for a longer period of time than a shorter period of time, because that, this is a relational practice. It's how the trust builds up. It's how you get to really uncover what the issues of that place are, just through your own experience. But it's, these conversations can happen in layers. And, what might be the most obvious problem of place may not be the one that actually is the most urgent one. And you get to see those kind of differences over time. And you can follow your nose, and partnerships and links and things begin to happen in the most fantastic serendipitous way. And of course, when you're bringing art into place, there is that horrible moment in that very literal way where a place has to be retrofitted to get the art in, whether that's putting electricity in or the water source, wherever it is. And that's just, I don't think anybody in this room would advocate for that kind of approach at all. But I think something which I've been musing on, and this kind of perhaps comes into the COVID thing, is that you can get quite a lot done in a short period of time. And I was musing on that because of thinking about those serendipitous conversations you have with people as you're moving around your everyday life. And you can get quite into those conversations. But I think, and so, I've worked with funders that have given, we've had funding, literally just for a couple of months. It's like, okay, so what can we do in that time? And it is a question of having a methodology that is sound enough that you can hit the ground running with it, but also making your own expectations and the expectations of those that you're working with very clear about what can be achieved in that period of time. And then what, in relation to COVID, myself and Dr. Anita McKeown have been thinking a lot around the experience of COVID and Black Lives Matter and climate emergency as being ones of trauma associated with place. And so being in lockdown in our homes, we don't have that public connection, and there's a trauma in that. There's a very obvious trauma with Black Lives Matter, but obviously that also works in its many different ways and it will resonate through those places down the generations, as will COVID, I'm sure. And so it would be, I question, I don't have answers to this, but I do question how we will be when we go back out, en masse as a collective in place again. There will be fear? Will people really be gung-ho for it and go to the other extreme completely? And then that also makes me think about what is our responsibility as placemakers in that, to make places safe at a very basic level, and who we should be talking to, and how does that need a revision in light of COVID and Black Lives Matter and the syndemic of that, also then with climate emergency with us now and advancing ever rapidly.
Yeah, it's interesting, business improvement districts, when they're first set up, their two biggest remits always are clean and safe, right? And now they've started to look at helping commerce. They have more responsibility in terms of culture and partnerships and such. But actually, there is that structure in some cities and places that is purposefully built in, where their first remit, is clean and safe. And so I think, perhaps what you're talking about also is bringing those individuals into the process and the partnership, as collaborators, not as someone who's restricting, but you change their role. Like, again, one of the things we did in Times Square as our security team, instead of them telling people not to do things, we changed all the language so that they would go forward to people and say, encourage them to engage. Or, you know, we did this 12-hour piece overnight, and everybody was so worried about what would happen in Times Square, letting people in the middle of the night. But the security there was there to say to people, you know, oh, it's okay. Come on in and try it. Don't worry, I'm right here. There's another person downstairs. If for any reason, you know, you don't feel comfortable, like, we're here. And they turn their role into, you know, really safety, as opposed to what many people are approaching. And also, so many of the security officers spoke, you know, 3 to 5 languages each. So
we've
again,
done that. Yeah, we've done that as Tate as well. So in my role at Tate, the security and our visitor experiences they are teams that are there to open up the gallery, the collection to people, not to close it down. And again, yes, they all on their lanyards, they all have different badges to say what different languages they speak.
Yeah.
And it's an embarrassment of riches. There's something like 110 languages spoken just within Tate Modern. It's absolutely incredible. And I do think, though, that, you know, we've learned a lot from cutie pot communities around the welcome. We've learned a lot around those that have various different access needs to the welcome. And we've learned a lot from retail as well, because retail is a really good example of somewhere where you're going to have a really sharp pair of eyes, but also be really welcoming. Yeah. And so I think there are all sorts of different knowledges that can come into this, and yeah, just to start to flip things around really simply can have a really exponential effect. I have to go now. Thank you very much and enjoy.
Yes, and if we could all just say a big thank you also to Cara for this incredible work and pulling together so many incredible people.
It was a pleasure, and everybody else did the work, not me. See you soon.
All right, thanks, Cara. And I think that's a good transition. We're going to start taking some of the questions from the audience and prioritizing. I don't know. It's coming up with what might segue. So Francesco Mazzarella, you ask about at the current time in which in-person experience has often translated then into online, what risk does a digital counterpart of place, or we risk that the digital counterpart of place may lack authenticity? What ways do you suggest tackling this issue? What do you think the role of digital will be as far as enhancing people's experiences of place? I guess this is important now, right? We're all conscious that there is a digital place shaping, you know, that's happening simultaneously now with our in life. So anyone on the team want to start that one off, thinking about how the digital and the analog are going to help shape our places?
I think I might first say that the digital is no less authentic than the in-person. And I think that in terms of theater, sometimes I felt less welcome in the theater venues, the physical theater venues, than I have online. And so I think it's really important to think about ways in which we innovate a practice that makes the online just as meaningful and even more accessible than some physical places have actually been. I'm, as an applied theatre lecturer at Central School of Speech and Drama, one of the things that I'm setting up for students next term is a project where we are working with the dementia ward at NHS, and the seniors in this dementia ward have been in this ward since before lockdown. So it's more than a year now. And we're using the digital, we're using VR, we're using all these things to recreate places that they miss, whether it's a walk that they really miss in a forest, or it's the place where they met their loved one. And, you know, I think these are the ways in which the role of the digital really comes to enhance people's experiences of place. Because in that interaction, you might even make new stories, new memories.
I add something to that? Because I think it's a really important factor. It is also this idea of what's local now. You know, like just because we live next to somebody doesn't mean that we necessarily have any sense of community. So whereas actually we can have a sense of community to someone on the other side of the world because we have a common denominator, common interest. And I think that this came up this morning. We were in a workshop where somebody said, well, actually, something as simple as a WhatsApp group has transformed my street. Because now all of a sudden it's brought everybody's voices out of their houses into a space, and it's made the introduction, it's done the icebreaker before we weren't necessarily able to do. But I think that to Adelina, to your point, what we lack sometimes in the digital is kind of, you know, it can feel mundane. At the moment we're all sat. I mean, I wish, Sherry, I wish that I was in, you know, Times Square with you. But the point is, yeah, exactly. The point is that we're all still sat at home. And so digital has the ability to make a little magic. And I think that it works really well. And we've seen some perfect examples of this, like Swamp Motel, if anyone has seen that over the last year. An incredible immersive online digital piece where we role play or we step into another world. And there are again, small cues and clues that we work with as experienced designers or placemakers in real life to help people leave that everyday behind, step into something a little different, and suddenly start to pay more attention to the place, look, you know, enable or inhabit a different role, you know. And so the more we can do that online, perhaps the more wonder we can start to create.
I'm gonna combine a couple of questions here, and I think I'm just gonna lazily put it under the banner of exclusion, perhaps. There's a question about addressing placekeeping and gentrification and the threat that placemaking will disrupt is very meaning. There's a question also about how homeless people are often planned out of the public space. And there's another question about, you know, what's the role of children in placemaking? You know, very often, particularly with teenagers, we just have this gap, right? Like everybody loves the children when they're young and cute, and then we want them when they're young people who are going into skills and development, and then we kind of want to ignore this phase. And so I guess I'll just throw that as a sort of general comment for people to join in. How do you ensure that you keep that inclusive nature, and that while you're improving a place, you're not necessarily displacing people? And how do you get to harder to reach people who maybe don't have an email address and don't have a physical mailing address?
Can I jump in, and then I'd love to actually hear Michaela's thoughts on this specifically too. But one of the things, just to share, that in the US context, there's been over the last 10 years, a significant shift in, and I want to actually connect those three questions to the question about belonging and safety, and also the question about invitation and permission. It's just sort of who's leading, and to me, it's a question of leadership and ownership of the work. And I think, you know, whereas in the US, at least, it started with a very top-down, government-led, mayoral supported, tribal leader supported, you know, initiative. There has been a natural evolution alongside the social change happening in our country and around the world, to connecting placemaking to community organizing, right? And to grassroots community organizing, and sort of this idea of who leads and who benefits, is, if those are your starting points, then you're going to actually be about place knowing and place keeping. You're going to be, it's not a question of invitation, but involvement, right? Who is participating, who else, you know, laterally, who is participating in the work, and then how, you know, who is setting the future, who is creating the structure to set the future of their place, right? And then that question of who is involved, whether it is working with a homeless community to define what they need in public space, working with newcomers to a community in the US that are, you know, migration patterns are changing dramatically here, and what it means to like who you're serving with a project. Really, it starts with who starts the project, right, and who is leading. And so I think that's an important shift that's happened here in sort of redefining what placemaking actually is. That is, to me, an undercurrent of all of those questions. So when it, you know, comes to displacement, we use the term displacement rather than gentrification, because we're actually talking about, you know, you're never going to have a policy that tells people where they can and cannot move, but you can have a policy that prevents people from being displaced involuntarily. And so if the people who risk displacement, whether that's financially, physically, or culturally, are involved in the project, you can bet that the project is going to happen differently, right? And it'll benefit them and the existing community. So I don't mean to rant too much, but I just wanted to bring that idea of grassroots organizing, community organizing into the picture.
Michaela, do you want to join in? You don't have to, just because
No,
Amy called you, but
it's fine. No, I think also for sure within our Indigenous planning work, we do use the framework of 7 generations. And so what that means for us in our practice and our theoretical sort of underpinnings about that is that when you think about the involvement or the, yes, the involvement, but then also like who needs to be maybe involved in the process, or even who gets left out in the process, we refer to 7 generations. So that's imagining yourself as the middle generation, and then the 3 generations before you, who are your parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, and then the 3 generations after you, which are your children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And so for us, like all of those generations need to be present in order for there to be a more sort of much more holistic and like healthy way about like going about what it is that the community wants to do. And I will second Jamie too, in that like it does really begin at the grassroots level. I mean, our project in Zuni Pueblo would not have been successful had it not been the involvement of the artists themselves. And yes, sure, the tribal governor allowed this project to take place, but without them, we would not have had the success that we had. And I think that's also because within Zuni Pueblo, over 80% of their population consider themselves artists. And so that's also how they make their living. And so it was really important for that representation of the 80% to be part of that project, but then also like speaking to like the contemporary and also the traditional, so artisans that make up the community. And so yeah, at least in the case of Zuni Pueblo, there hadn't been the issue of homelessness. However, there is I think a need for housing in Zuni and a lot of other Indigenous communities. And that goes without saying, though, that a lot of our traditional like familial structures are intergenerational anyways. So we could be living with our grandmas or grandpas or aunts and uncles, and there's nothing wrong with that, which does counter to like the normative around like nuclear families that just focus on like mom, dad, and children. So yeah, I think it's definitely certainly relative to wherever you're working and who you are going to be working with.
Yeah, and that idea of the term here is co-living, so that it can include either intergenerational or whether it means the sort of self-defined family, but that more and more we're living in these ways, not just because of economics, but by choice, realizing that is how we want to form our own sort of first circle of community to then work its way out. What I would love to do now is we're going to break out into groups. You're going to be thrown arbitrarily into rooms with different speakers. And this is for everyone to just be able to have a little one-to-one time. And we did have this event only scheduled for an hour. So I understand there are quite a few people who've had to go because they only planned an hour. We've extended it, the time, because we wanted to leave this time. Throw into these conversations, and then our speakers are going to gather a quick thought from each of those, and we'll bring that back together in the group in a conclusion. So Tanisha, are you going to tell us how we do this?
Yep. So I'm going to be opening all rooms now, and you will magically find yourself with one of the speakers. And we'll see you back in the main session in 10 minutes.
Hello, we're all coming back.
Our conversation was just getting good. They were actually talking about East Bank and East Village and the V&A and picking up culture trauma, and it went back in. So I grabbed one.
Oh, wow.
I know this can happen sometimes. I think what we want to do, but I mean, Yaz, you know, and who was the speaker in your group too? Do you want to throw in anything more from that group, and then I'll go down the other breakout groups?
Yeah, is it Adelina? Sorry if I've mispronounced the name. It's it was to do with picking up what she was talking about with dementia and trauma. That then turned into a conversation from Francesco, who asked about with migrants who come to an area and sometimes out of self-preservation shed that heritage for whatever reason, and what that then means in terms of craft and skill, which then I shared with the group. There's a girl that I'm mentoring who's at St. Martin's, who's West Indian like me, but her grandmother, that lack of continuity meant she didn't understand, for example, that for the West Indians, fashion post Windrush was how they were able to communicate in a hostile racist country, that they weren't animals, they were articulate, which then Fabienne was talking about, you know, is there more to look at in terms of using or reframing identity and placemaking to support this sort of simultaneous healing, and to use a phrase I sort of just did, picking up the thread. So if you pick up the thread to continue the craft, you can also heal the trauma. So it's using that, yeah, that's just when the session ended. But they referenced the V&A, what they're doing in East London, as a sort of live case study of what that could look like in the future.
Great.
Thank you so much for that summary, Yasmin. That's great.
Right. I'm a journalist, so I'm kind of used to like grabbing what I can and then playing it back. So it was, you did a brilliant moderation, by the way. I was not expecting that. My mind is blown.
So this is great. Your group, you've met each other, and we can also find ways and continue on. Rosanna, did you have any key things that came up in your conversation?
Our conversation was around this tension between permissions and also finding the interesting spots. Peter raised this this really fascinating kind of liminal space in Canary Wharf, where when the tide recedes, the beach belongs to nobody. And so it literally is a place where anything is possible because no one has any jurisdiction over it. So finding these spaces is actually an interesting place to play out some new ideas for public space. But then on the flip side, we had Richard in our group who was talking about how he almost let's say started from a grassroots approach in Ireland, but then was able to work his way up to make a case for cultural placemaking in the system. So in a similar, on the flip side, he's almost trying to make sure that it is kind of systemic and there is something in there. And Aida just got going talking about Harlow and the idea of art kind of everywhere. So I think a lot of the big question really remains about clean and safe. Yeah, but how safe? If we're gonna, and for whom? You know, are we going to destroy the ability to discover if we do so? Are we gonna, you know, are we in essence sanitizing everything? But I think we've got to look at like what the stakes are. You know, so if the stakes are serious, like I'm ending up in prison. Yeah, let's keep it safe. If the stakes are okay, I might like fall over here, you know, whatever. Okay, maybe that's discover something I don't like around the corner. That's maybe okay. And I think that's an important factor.
Yeah, I think like you say, and this keeps coming up, you know, how you establish definitions with your project. You know, they're not all going to be the same. You have to really be specific to place and people. Michaela, do you want to share anything from your group?
Yeah, so I was just asked to speak a little bit more about like 7-generational framework, and so I did a little bit more background into that theoretical formation that happened, and it is attributed to an ancestral site in New Mexico called Pueblo Bonito, and so it really is a great example of how it took 7 phases. If you look at the archaeological evidence, 7 phases of that Pueblo Bonito to be developed. That, you know, it really does matter that the person who starts the process of this vision of what the community is aspiring towards, that vision continues to get inherited intergenerationally. So you know, in order to get to that, then it requires a lot of dialogue and, you know, refinement of what that vision is going to be. And so that, you know, there's a consensus around what the community is working towards. And then we ran out of time when I was trying to go into some techniques that we use in or that we employ in our work. But I'm hoping that there will be a chance for us to share resources. So anyone who was part of this call, that they might be able to reference those.
Yep, and we'll send something following this. And the other thing I would encourage is, particularly Michaela and other contributors to the book, if you haven't done your video and put it up on the YouTube channel, that would also be great. Because if you were about to explain how the 7 generations work, you know, use that as an opportunity to put that out there and everybody to go back to that. Jamie, what about from your group?
Yeah, we sort of continue. We started by continuing the conversation about displacement, well, specifically homeless in benches, right? And we actually got into a specific context in case, and you know, in terms of the citing of things, and what it evolved into was sort of a conversation about the just multiple competing publics. Right, when you're working in public space, and that sort of what makes one group feel safe might not make another group feel not safe, right? And so really deciding early in a process where and for whom, you know, who you are serving and who are you excluding. Again, continuing the themes of what came up earlier. And then we talked a bit more about sort of serving specific populations that are often hard to reach. Luzanne was there talking about the parkour work that they do, and just understanding. I was about to start talking when we got cut off about sort of how different art forms are. You know, we don't often, especially my work at ArtPlace, we work so much on the non-art side, right? Making the case and bringing them in and sort of almost recruiting and evangelizing. But actually, when you get into the nuance of different art forms and how some can serve different audiences, different publics, and different purposes very differently than others, that's sort of where I thought we were going to be headed had the conversation continued.
That's great. This is the beginning of others. And then in the art group, just quickly as I look at time, you know, we were talking about international and also local artists and understanding, you know, how you broach that, how you make availability, how you involve also local artists and understand what they might want from international or multicultural, that it might help them to actually stir a conversation on behalf. But when you make those choices, what you need to think about, and also that idea of constantly 365 days, keeping some opportunity that's available so the best ideas always get forward, no matter where somebody comes from. And that led on to also this idea of digital has really, Chloe brought this up, you know, that digital has really opened up a new opportunity for local, where your global can be local very quickly, and how it's transformed, you know, in the last year, this sense of accessibility and accessing people, conversations, networks. And as you can see here, like we're all on a democratic sort of page, and how important that is. So we come to our conclusion. I really, really want to thank everybody, and especially for those of you who hang on till the end. As you can see, we've got some incredible people, not just who are on the panel, but also in the audience. There's so many of you. Hello, and thank you for joining in. So please keep the conversation going. For social media, use the hashtag Futurecity Placemaking. Make sure you follow us. We're at Futurecity blog. We'd love to pull you and into our conversation, our resources, and people we can work with and pull into projects. Keep in touch. Sign up to our mailing list. We'll send you more events. We'll have more placemaking happy hours, as this seems to work quite well. And it's our first webinar, so tell us what we did right, what we could do better, and we'll be sending a feedback form. Thank you, Eventbrite, for being able to quickly send out to others. And I know there were some people who really wanted to come and had various commitments come up last minute. So it's really great that they'll also be able to see this recording and see all of you as a part of it. So on behalf of all of Futurecity and our founder, Mark Davey, also who's here, give a little wave. Who didn't wave before. Just want to thank you and all of our team who helped on the breakout sessions. Thanks for coming together and sharing this time with us.
Thanks all. Thank you.
Thank you, Hagone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sherry, and thank you everyone at Futurecity.
Thank you, Adelina.
Yes, thank you.
I'm like, are we in the safe place now?
I was going to ask if would you guys be able to send us the screen grab of everyone, and I'll put it on Twitter. That would be cool. And thanks.
Yeah, Tanisha, are you able to do that? You're on mute.